I kept tasting the words before they reached my tongue, like a coin held too long in the mouth. Metallic, wrong, impossible to swallow. It wasn't that I didn't know what to say. That was the cruelest part. The sentence formed cleanly every time, simple enough to fit in a single breath. It wasn't clever, it wasn't dramatic. It was only a warning, plain and necessary. The kind of thing you say when you see someone step into a dark room and you know there's a stair missing. But every time I tried to let it out, my throat tightened as if it had learned the shape of silence better than speech. There were moments when I almost did it without thinking. A small movement forward, a shift of weight, a hand lifting from my side, as if my body could speak for me when my voice refused. And then, always the same, something inside me pulled back like a leash snapped tight. The air would stall in my chest. My jaw would lock. My eyes would drop to the floor, to anything but the faces I would have to meet if I broke the quiet. It wasn't courage that I lacked. I didn't have the luxury of measuring myself against a clean idea like that. Courage sounds like a choice you make once, in a single bright moment. This was different. This was a long, slow narrowing, a corridor getting tighter with every hour, until even breathing felt like it might scrape the walls. The warning didn't frighten me because it was uncertain. It frightened me because it was clear. Clarity is dangerous in places where certainty belongs to other people. I had seen what happened to those who spoke out of turn. Not always loudly. Sometimes it was subtle, a look that froze them in place, a pause that made their words feel childish, the way a room could swallow a man's voice and leave nothing behind but embarrassment. Other times it was sharper, a correction delivered calmly, with the kind of politeness that made it worse. A reminder of where you stood, a reminder that you weren't there to think, only to receive. And once you've been reminded, your mind learns to anticipate the punishment. It starts to punish itself. I told myself I wasn't certain enough, that I didn't have the whole picture, that I was too close to see straight, too afraid to be objective. I told myself the people above me had already considered what I saw and judged it acceptable. I told myself that if there was danger, it was not my place to name it. I told myself that the world ran on obedience, and that a single voice had no right to interrupt the machinery. All of it sounded reasonable in the privacy of my own head. Then the moment would come again. Some small opening, some breath of opportunity, and the warning would rise like a hand reaching for light. And I would feel the weight of everything that could follow if I spoke, the attention snapping toward me, the thin smile that meant I'd overstepped, the instant reshaping of how I was seen. Not as reliable, not as steady, not as safe. Safe. That word kept returning, soft and shameful, because I knew what my silence was really protecting. Not them. Me. I could feel the warning sitting behind my teeth like a splinter. It hurt when I tried to ignore it, hurt in a way that didn't show on my face. I would swallow and swallow, as if I could force it down into my stomach where it might dissolve. But it didn't dissolve. It stayed. It waited. It grew heavier. With each second I delayed, as if the words themselves gained mass, pressing harder against the inside of my chest. Sometimes I imagined saying it, just once, quietly, without drama. I imagined it landing in the air between us and changing the direction of what was coming. I imagined the relief that would follow, the clean sensation of having done what was necessary. Then I imagined the other thing, the same words, spoken, and the room turning cold around me, the faces hardening, the thought, unspoken but immediate, that I had made myself a problem. And I didn't want to be a problem. I wanted to be invisible, useful, easy to move past. That is the truth I don't like admitting, even now. Not because it makes me monstrous, because it makes me ordinary. The warning returned again, as it always did, standing at the edge of my mouth, and I stood there with it, feeling my heart beat against my ribs, feeling the moment pass like a train I could have boarded if I'd only lifted a foot. But I didn't lift it. I let the train go, and in the space it left behind I chose silence like it was already my only language. By the time the days started to blur together, I understood the real rule of that place. Nothing was ever said plainly unless it came from above. We lived inside routine the way men live inside weather, It wasn't questioned. It wasn't discussed. It was endured and eventually depended on. You woke when you were told, ate when you were told, moved when you were told. Even the smallest choices, where to stand, when to speak, what to look at, felt borrowed, like the air itself belonged to someone else, and you were allowed to breathe it only as long as you didn't complain. The building we worked from was never quiet, but it was never truly loud either. It had its own steady pulse, boots crossing hard floors, paper sliding across tables, the rasp of a match struck to light a cigarette that no one openly acknowledged. The sounds were muted by discipline. Even laughter, when it happened, came out restrained, like a man checking over his shoulder before allowing himself the weakness of relief. There were rooms you entered without speaking at all, not because anyone told you to, but because the silence had been established long before you arrived. You learned it the way you learn a language from hearing it spoken correctly around you. A pause meant someone important was thinking. A cough meant someone lower had dared to exist too loudly. A chair scraping at the wrong moment could feel like a confession. The hierarchy wasn't written anywhere that I saw. It didn't need ink. It was built into posture, into tone, into the angle of a man's chin when he spoke. Some voices carried weight without effort. Other voices had to fight to be heard, and fighting to be heard was treated like a flaw. There were men who had been there longer than me who never raised their eyes unless spoken to, not because they were timid by nature. I could tell, watching them move, that they had once been the kind of men who filled rooms, but the system had pared them down. It had sanded their edges off until they became smooth, obedient shapes that fit wherever they were placed. At first, I thought that meant they were weak. Later, I realized it meant they had learned how to survive. I was close enough to hear things I wasn't meant to repeat. I carried messages, copied figures, stood at the edge of conversations where maps were unfolded and refolded like secrets. I was not important enough to be included, but not invisible enough to be spared the proximity. It put me in the worst position a person can be in during wartime, near the center of decisions, without a hand on the lever. And decisions were made constantly, not with ceremony, not with speeches, often with a pencil tapping the edge of a table, or a finger tracing a line across paper, or a brief exchange that ended with a single word that closed the matter. The word itself could be ordinary. Good, fine, proceed. But when it came from the right mouth, it turned into law. In that environment, speech wasn't only sound, it was risk. A man could get away with error if it was the right kind of error, the kind that matched the room's expectations. Mistakes that confirmed what authority already believed could be forgiven, adjusted, quietly buried. But questioning the direction of authority, that was a different category entirely. That wasn't treated as concern. It was treated as challenge. And challenge was the one thing that could not be tolerated, because challenge suggested that the system might be fallible. Fallibility was more frightening than the enemy. I watched it play out in small ways before I ever felt it press against my own ribs. Someone would offer a detail, carefully phrased, meant to be helpful. The response would come back with a thin calmness that left no room for discussion. Not anger, not shouting. Worse than anger, a kind of cool patience, like a father correcting a child who had embarrassed himself in public. After that, the man would become quieter. Not immediately, not as a dramatic change. But you would see it over days, the slow retreat. He would speak less. He would sit further back. He would check his own expression before it formed. Sometimes he would get reassigned. Sometimes he would simply stop being present in the rooms where things mattered. He would still exist, still work, still obey, but he would no longer be trusted near the gears. Trust was the currency, and it could be spent in a single sentence. Everyone knew it. Even those who acted fearless knew it. Fear had its own etiquette there. It was never admitted. It sat in the background like smoke, thin but constant. You could see it in the way men chose their words, in the way they waited a half-second longer before answering, just enough to calculate what the room wanted, in the way their eyes moved, quickly to the right faces, quickly away from the wrong ones. There were times when I stood behind a chair with a file in my hands, and I could feel the shape of the room's attention without anyone looking at me directly. It was like being submerged in cold water. The wrong movement could ripple outward. So I learned to make myself small. I learned to deliver information without owning it. If I had to report something that might be unwelcome, I did it in the flattest tone possible, as if I were reading numbers from a ledger and not touching something alive. I learned to keep my face neutral even when I felt my stomach drop. I learned that the safest words were the words that sounded like they came from someone else. And I learned something else, quietly, without anyone teaching it to me. Once you stop speaking freely, you start doubting your own mind. It doesn't happen all at once. It starts with caution, then it becomes habit, then it becomes identity. You begin to tell yourself that your instincts are unreliable, that your perspective is too narrow, that you are not qualified to interpret what you see. You begin to defer not only outwardly, but inwardly. You hand over your judgment the way you hand over a weapon at the door. That was the environment. Not a battlefield, not a charge, not the kind of war that looks dramatic from a distance. This was the war of rooms and paper and voices arranged in an order that could not be disturbed. The war where men died because lines were drawn and redrawn, and where the people closest to the lines were often the least able to move them. I was one of those people, and the warning I carried, the one that kept rising inside me, didn't feel like a sudden realization. It felt like something I had been noticing in pieces, day after day, like a crack in a wall that grew longer each time you looked away and looked back. The crack wasn't dramatic. It was almost ordinary, which made it worse. Because ordinary flaws are the easiest to ignore when everyone around you is trained to look past them. So I watched, I listened, I kept my hands busy, I kept my eyes lowered at the right moments. I made myself useful, dependable, safe. And all the while I felt that warning harden into something sharper, something that no longer felt like instinct, but like knowledge. Still, knowledge didn't grant permission. In that place, permission came from above, and conscience was not part of the chain of command. So I kept it inside me, and I let the days carry it forward, closer and closer to the moment when it would matter most. The longer I stayed silent, the more my thoughts began to circle themselves, like animals pacing a cage they could no longer see. At first, the warning came to me as a sharp thing, clear, edged, almost intrusive. It arrived uninvited, pushing its way into my mind during moments when I was supposed to be focused on something else. A figure on a page would catch my eye, and suddenly I would see what it implied rather than what it stated. A phrase spoken aloud would echo longer than it should, revealing a gap between what was said and what was meant. I would feel it then, a tightening just below my ribs, a sense that something didn't align the way everyone pretended it did. But as time passed, that sharpness dulled, not because the danger faded, because my mind learned to soften it. I began to argue with myself in small, careful steps. I told myself that concern was not the same as certainty, that unease was not evidence, that what I felt could easily be colored by fatigue, by fear, by my own limited view. I reminded myself, repeatedly, that I was not the one responsible for seeing the whole picture, that others had more experience, more information, more authority, that if there truly was something wrong, it would have been noticed already. This was not denial. It was negotiation. Every day I negotiated the terms of my own silence. There were moments when the internal debate grew loud enough that I feared it might spill out of me without permission. I would be standing close enough to hear breath drawn before a sentence, close enough to feel the weight of attention shift, and I would think, now. If I speak now, it will still be early enough. If I speak now, it will sound like diligence, not dissent. If I speak now, it can be framed as a question instead of a challenge. My body would respond before my courage did. My heart would speed up, my mouth would go dry, my fingers would twitch as if reaching for something to hold me in place. And in that split second before action, another thought would always arrive. Quieter, but heavier. What if I'm wrong? It sounds harmless when written down, almost responsible. But that question carried a shadow with it. Because being wrong in that place didn't mean embarrassment alone. It meant exposure. It meant becoming visible in the worst possible way. It meant being remembered not for obedience or reliability, but for disruption. I had seen how quickly a man could become a story instead of a presence. The mind is capable of building entire futures in the time it takes for a breath to leave the lungs. In those moments, I would see it all unfold ahead of me. I would imagine the pause after I spoke, The way the room would still, not in surprise, but in recalibration. I would imagine the eyes lifting, measuring me, reassessing. I would imagine the response, measured, controlled, possibly even polite, and beneath it the quiet conclusion, he overstepped. From there, the imagined consequences spread outward. I would see myself being excluded, slowly, cleanly, without open conflict. Fewer responsibilities, fewer invitations into rooms where decisions were shaped. The subtle shift in how my name was spoken, the way trust, once cracked, never quite returned to its original form. And then I would imagine the other possibility, the one that scared me more because it was harder to dismiss. What if I spoke, and nothing changed? What if the warning was acknowledged, considered, and then set aside? What if it became one more note among many, filed away under acceptable risk? In that version of the future, I would not only be exposed, I would be irrelevant. I would have sacrificed my safety for a gesture that accomplished nothing. I would still have to live with the outcome, except now I would live with it as someone who had tried and failed. That possibility hollowed me out. It was easier, in some twisted way, to remain silent and preserve the illusion that my words, unspoken, still held power. As long as I didn't say them, they could remain perfect, untested, untainted by dismissal. Silence allowed me to believe that I would have mattered, if only the circumstances had been different. This is how silence protects itself, by convincing you that it is temporary. I told myself I was waiting for a better moment, a clearer opening, a sign that my voice would be welcome. I told myself that timing was everything, and that speaking too early could be as dangerous as speaking too late. I told myself that patience was a form of wisdom, but patience, when paired with fear, becomes delay, and delay, when repeated often enough, becomes a habit that feels indistinguishable from choice. There were nights when the debate followed me even when the day ended. I would lie awake staring into darkness, replaying fragments of conversations in my mind. I would reconstruct them, adjust my imagined responses, test different versions of myself, braver, calmer, more articulate. In those private rehearsals, everything worked. The warning was delivered cleanly. It was received seriously. It altered the course of what was coming. Then morning would arrive, and with it the familiar weight of reality. The rooms, the faces, the hierarchy that pressed down on everything like gravity, and the rehearsed courage would evaporate, leaving behind only the faint embarrassment of having believed in it. I started to notice how often I flinched internally, not physically but somewhere deeper, at a phrase that should have raised concern, at a dismissal that came too quickly, at an assumption stated with too much confidence. Each time I felt that inner recoil, the part of me that recognized danger pulling back, as if to protect itself from being forced into action. I hated that part of myself, and I relied on it, because it was the part that kept me safe. I began to frame my silence as responsibility rather than avoidance. I told myself that maintaining order was more important than personal conviction, that discipline required restraint, that chaos could emerge not only from bad decisions, but from too many voices competing to correct them. I told myself that the system, flawed as it might be, existed for a reason, and that undermining it from within could cause harm of its own. All of this sounded reasonable. All of it sounded like the kind of thinking that was rewarded. What I did not admit, even to myself, was how much relief I felt each time the moment passed without forcing me to act. Relief that I had survived another day without becoming visible. Relief that I had not drawn attention to myself. Relief that the burden of decision remained someone else's. That relief came with a cost. I could feel it accumulating, slow and steady. Each unspoken word added weight to the next. Each rationalization made the next one easier. And with each repetition, the warning inside me changed shape. It no longer felt like something urgent that needed to be said. It began to feel like something dangerous that needed to be contained. I was no longer just holding my tongue. I was guarding it. There were moments when I wondered whether silence, practiced long enough, could reshape a person entirely, whether the part of me that recognized the danger would eventually dull beyond usefulness, whether I would reach a point where the warning no longer rose at all, replaced by a smooth, empty acceptance. That thought frightened me more than speaking ever had. Because if the warning disappeared, I would be free of this tension, but only because I had surrendered the part of myself that noticed. Still, even that fear was not enough to force my hand. Each day brought new opportunities to speak, and each day I found a new reason not to. The balance never tipped decisively. It hovered, always, just out of reach. The silence thickened, not with drama, but with familiarity. And somewhere in that growing familiarity, I felt the moment approaching, the one where silence would no longer be a temporary shelter, but a permanent mark. I could sense it drawing closer, like pressure building behind a wall that everyone pretended was solid. And I remained quiet, telling myself that as long as I hadn't yet refused to speak, I still could, even as I felt that belief beginning to slip away. The moment arrived without ceremony. There was no sudden hush, no dramatic shift in the air, no instinctive sense that history had narrowed itself to a single breath. It came the way most irreversible things do, disguised as routine, folded neatly into the shape of an ordinary exchange. I was standing close enough to hear the soft scrape of paper being turned, close enough to see the slight hesitation of a hand before it settled on a final position, close enough to recognize the pause, not long, not uncertain, just long enough to signal consideration had occurred and was now complete. The flawed decision did not announce itself as flawed. It arrived already dressed in confidence. It was delivered in a tone that suggested resolution rather than inquiry, a tone that implied the matter had been weighed, measured, and found acceptable. I felt the warning surge up inside me with a clarity that bordered on pain. It was no longer theoretical, no longer something that might unfold later, if conditions aligned badly enough. It was immediate. The pieces I had been watching separately, numbers, movements, assumptions, locked together in my mind with an audible finality. I could almost feel it click into place, the way a door closes when you realize too late that you've stepped into the wrong room. This was it. Not a future risk, not an abstract concern. This was the point where a word, one word spoken at the right moment, could still alter the shape of what followed. I knew exactly how to say it, not loudly, not emotionally, just enough to interrupt the flow, just enough to introduce friction, just enough to force a second look. My body reacted before my thoughts could reorganize themselves. My chest tightened. My pulse climbed into my throat. The muscles in my jaw tensed as if bracing against a blow. I became acutely aware of my own physical presence, of how visible I would become the instant I opened my mouth. Time stretched, not into something dramatic, but into something fragile, a narrow ledge between before and after. The voice that had spoken did not rush. It waited, as if offering space for acknowledgement, not dissent. The silence that followed was not an invitation. It was a closing. I felt my chance narrowing with every fraction of a second. There was a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, when my weight shifted forward. It wasn't intentional. It was the body's instinct to step toward danger when the mind recognizes it. My lips parted. The first breath of speech reached the back of my throat, and then everything that had trained me into stillness asserted itself at once. I saw the faces I would have to face. I felt the invisible boundary I would be crossing. I sensed the attention that would turn toward me, not with curiosity but with recalculation. I understood, with sudden and devastating clarity, that this would not be heard as assistance. It would be heard as interruption, as doubt, as resistance. I imagined the sentence leaving my mouth and immediately ceasing to belong to me. I imagined it being stripped of its intent, reduced to its inconvenience. I imagined myself standing there afterward, having said the thing, unable to take it back, unable to control what it became once released. And beneath all of that, quieter but more persuasive than fear, was something worse. The certainty that once spoken, the warning could be dismissed, that it could vanish into the same machinery that had produced this moment in the first place. If I stayed silent, the warning remained intact inside me, unsullied, unquestioned, perfect. If I spoke, it risked being broken, bent, or erased. That thought tipped the balance, not toward bravery, toward preservation. I swallowed. The physical act was small, almost invisible, but inside, It felt like sealing something behind a wall. The muscles in my throat closed around the words and forced them downward, back into the place they had been waiting. My mouth closed. My breath evened out, carefully, deliberately, as if nothing had nearly escaped. The moment passed. The decision moved forward, gathering momentum as it went. Others nodded, pens moved, chairs shifted. The room adjusted itself around the new reality with practiced ease. The machinery resumed its rhythm, uninterrupted. No one looked at me. No one needed to. I remained where I was, silent and functional, my expression arranged into the neutral shape that kept me safe. From the outside, nothing about me had changed. I was still useful, still invisible, still compliant. Inside, something hardened. The warning did not fade. It did not soften. It settled into a different weight entirely. No longer a possibility, no longer a choice, but a fact I would now have to carry forward. I understood, in that instant, that silence is not the absence of action. It is an action taken fully, deliberately, and without witnesses. And once taken, it cannot be undone. The room moved on. So did the decision. And I stood there, knowing that whatever followed would no longer be something I could pretend had surprised me. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They never do. At first, nothing seemed to change. The routines held. The voices kept their measured cadence. The rooms continued to fill and empty on schedule. If someone had asked me in those first hours whether anything had gone wrong, I could have answered honestly that everything appeared to be proceeding as intended. That was the most unsettling part. The world has a way of confirming your silence by remaining orderly just long enough to make you doubt yourself. It offers you a brief window of false calm, as if to say, "See, nothing required your intervention after all." I clung to that calm more tightly than I should have. I told myself that perhaps I had misread the moment, that perhaps the flaw I thought I saw had been accounted for elsewhere, by someone with a broader view. I told myself that the tightness in my chest was nothing more than residual anxiety, the echo of a decision already made. I told myself that regret often disguises itself as foresight, but beneath those reassurances the warning did not sleep. It stayed awake inside me, alert to every small deviation, every report that came in slightly delayed, every adjustment that was explained too quickly, every reassurance that arrived with an extra sentence, as if padding were required to make it hold. I began to notice how often explanations leaned on optimism, not the loud kind, the quiet kind that sounds reasonable, the kind that says delays are temporary, that obstacles are manageable, that outcomes remain within acceptable margins, the kind of optimism that does not deny risk outright, but diminishes it through repetition. Each time I heard it, something in me tightened again. Days passed, then more days. The first undeniable sign did not come in the form of catastrophe. It came as inconsistency, figures that no longer aligned cleanly, accounts that required footnotes, timelines that shifted without explanation. Nothing dramatic enough to halt momentum, but enough to suggest strain. Strain is easy to excuse in wartime. There is always pressure, always friction, always the expectation that plans will bend under the weight of reality. That bending, we told ourselves, was proof of resilience. I watched as the bending deepened. I saw how conversations began to include more qualifiers, how certainty gave way to conditional language, how confidence was maintained not by clarity, but by insistence. The tone did not change much, but the content did. It became less precise, more aspirational, and still the machinery moved forward. The first confirmation of what I had feared arrived quietly, without announcement. A message delivered in a tone meant to sound routine. A phrase that slipped past most ears because it was framed as an update rather than a warning. When I heard it, my stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with surprise. It matched exactly what I had seen coming. Not in scale, not yet, but in direction. I remember standing there, listening, feeling a strange dual sensation take hold. On one hand, a grim clarity. This is it. This is the beginning of the shape I recognized. On the other hand, a hollow relief that frightened me more than fear ever had, because part of me thought I was right. That thought carried no satisfaction, no vindication, only weight. the kind of weight that settles into the bones and refuses to leave. As the days went on, that confirmation repeated itself in variations, not identical events, but echoes, patterns that reinforced one another. Each new development seemed minor when viewed alone, but together they formed a line so clear that I could trace it in my mind without effort. I stopped trying to convince myself that I had imagined the danger. The danger was now visible. What changed instead was how I related to it. Before, the warning had felt like something I carried alone. Now it felt like something the world itself was quietly proving, piece by piece. Each confirmation landed not as a shock, but as a dull thud of inevitability. I had the unsettling sense of watching something unfold in slow motion, powerless to intervene, yet unable to look away. There were moments when I wondered if this was what absolution felt like, if being proven right, after remaining silent, offered some twisted form of release. It did not. It only sharpened the question I could no longer avoid. If I knew and did nothing, what did that make me now? I began to measure time differently, not by days or hours, but by points of no return. Each new development felt like another door closing, another option disappearing, another chance, however unlikely, sliding beyond reach. The opportunity to speak had not vanished completely, but it had changed character. What could once have been offered as caution would now sound like accusation. What could once have been framed as diligence would now appear defensive. The later it became, the more my silence hardened into complicity. I could feel that shift inside me. The warning, once urgent, had transformed into something heavier and colder. It no longer urged action. It recorded facts. It cataloged consequences. It marked time. I started to notice how others reacted too, not with panic, but with adjustment. Plans were revised, expectations recalibrated, language adapted to accommodate the new reality. There was no collective moment of realization, no acknowledgement that something fundamental had gone wrong. Instead, there was acceptance. Acceptance dressed up as pragmatism. Watching it, I understood something that unsettled me deeply. Institutions are remarkably good at absorbing failure without ever naming it as such. They bend narratives, reframe objectives, and continue forward, all while preserving the appearance of control. The cost of that absorption is paid elsewhere. I did not witness the worst of it directly, not in a way that would make for dramatic telling. What I saw were fragments, reports stripped of detail, absences that were explained too efficiently, numbers that represented lives reduced to accounting. Each fragment aligned with the picture I had seen in advance. Each one tightened the knot inside me. I found myself listening more closely to silence than to speech, to what was not being said, to the pauses that grew longer, to the careful avoidance of certain topics. The same mechanisms that had once suppressed my voice were now suppressing acknowledgement. Silence, I realized, does not end when consequences begin. It expands. There were moments when I caught my reflection and barely recognized the person looking back, not because I looked different, but because I felt thinner somehow, as if something essential had been worn away by sustained restraint. I moved through my duties mechanically, efficiently, performing the actions expected of me while carrying an internal inventory of what I knew had been avoidable. I did not collapse under the weight of it. I did not break. That too frightened me, because it meant I was adapting. I began to understand that regret is not always loud. Often it is quiet and methodical. It settles in alongside routine, learns its rhythms, and makes itself at home. It does not demand attention. It waits. As the consequences continued to unfold, confirming my fear in stages rather than in spectacle, I felt the full shape of my silence come into focus, not as a single moment of cowardice, but as a sustained condition, a choice repeated daily, reinforced by every step I took that did not diverge from the path set before me. There was no longer any question of what I had feared. The only remaining question was how long I would carry the knowledge of having seen it coming, and having done nothing to stop it. That knowledge did not accuse me. It did something worse. It stayed. I still measure time by that silence, not by dates, not by anniversaries, not by official records. Those belong to institutions. What stayed with me was the pause, the exact length of it, the way it felt suspended between one breath and the next. I have replayed it so many times that it no longer feels like memory. It feels like a place I can still enter. Long after everything had settled into its final shape, long after the routines had adjusted, and the language had softened around what had happened, that moment remained untouched and unalterable. I would be doing something ordinary, standing in a line, holding a cup, waiting for a door to open, and without warning, I would feel it again, the tightening in my throat, the brief forward shift of my weight, the sensation of words pressing up against a barrier they were never meant to cross. My body remembered before my mind did. It always does. At first, I tried to frame it as a failure of circumstance. I told myself that no single voice could have changed what followed, that the machinery was already in motion, that my warning, even if spoken, would have been absorbed, diluted, or ignored. These thoughts came easily. They were well practiced. They had been rehearsed long before the moment itself. But memory has a way of stripping excuses down to their core. What remains, when everything else is removed, is not the question of outcome. It is the question of action. I know now that the deepest weight I carry is not what happened after. It is what did not happen before. The warning that stayed intact inside me, perfect and unused. The version of myself that existed for a fraction of a second. The one who almost spoke, and then vanished. I have tried to recall his face. I cannot. He dissolved the moment I chose silence. Guilt did not arrive as punishment. It arrived as familiarity. It became part of the way I thought, the way I listened, the way I stood in rooms where decisions were made. I learned to recognize it not as pain, but as pressure. A constant awareness that I was now living with knowledge that had no place to go. I noticed how easily others moved on. Not because they were callous, but because they had not stood where I stood. They had not felt the warning rise and then be forced back down. For them, events unfolded as events always do. Complex, unfortunate, regrettable. For me, they unfolded along a line I had already traced in my mind. That difference separated me from them in ways I never spoke aloud. There were times when I considered confessing, not publicly, not formally, but quietly, to someone who might understand. Not to absolve myself, but to acknowledge what I had carried alone. Each time the same hesitation returned. Not fear of consequence this time, but something colder. The knowledge that saying it now would not restore what silence had taken. Silence has permanence. Once it reshapes a moment, it reshapes the person who held it. I learned to live with that reshaping. I learned how to function with it, how to let it sit beneath my daily actions without disrupting them. From the outside, nothing marked me as different. I spoke when spoken to. I fulfilled my duties. I appeared composed. Inside, I kept a private inventory of moments when speech mattered. I became attentive to pauses, to hesitations, to the subtle signals that someone else might be standing where I once stood. When I sensed it, I felt a tightening, not of fear, but of recognition. I wanted to believe that if the moment came again, I would act differently. But belief is easier than proof. What I know for certain is this: the silence did not end when the consequences did. It did not fade with time. It did not soften into something easier to carry. It became a fixed point, a reference by which everything else is measured. Every warning I hear now is louder because of the one I never gave. Every moment of hesitation feels heavier because I know how easily it can become a lifetime. I do not tell this story to teach. I do not tell it to redeem myself. I tell it because the silence did not disappear when the moment passed. It stayed with me, and it is still speaking.